And his target here are precisely those like existentialist or neo-existentialist thinkers who believe that like the individual rebel, this kind of like antinomian rebel, can all by himself be a kind of like vanguard of like a revolutionary life. So like the kind of what's the fucking word I'm looking for? But uh, the recalcitrant individual who refuses, binding social norms, who refuses like, the social conventions that kind of like shrink and impoverish us. He alone can live some kind of, sovereign life of liberty, and beauty. And I think so Foucault has that in his sights as well. He's saying, no, insofar as you like characterize yourself and live as a mere individual, you're kind of playing into the hands of of disciplinary power. And like, even in a kind of like banal but more relatable form, just think about what happens to like kids in a bad school. Okay, they become kind of these mini individualists, and they start to think, okay, in order to get out of this shithole, what I need is to think up some other like beautiful form of life. Well, I can be like a doctor or a lawyer, or I can be, maybe I can be a writer or something. Now, then what do they do in their next step? Well, they start to abandon and desert their friends, and they devote themselves to a kind of like basically a form of like intellectual swatting. They want to become amazing at every single subject, and they look to kind of embellish and decorate their CV with a whole variety of extracurricular achievements. And they have in their sights like, an undergraduate course at Oxford University or Edinburgh University. And what I think Foucault is saying there is that the only thing perhaps that can overturn disciplinary power is kind of community, like conviviality amongst the people who are actually, you know, subjugated by this power, like oppressed and diminished by it, and precisely not this egotistic, individualistic kind of aspirationalism. You know, I- he's obviously not. He doesn't have that example in mind, but those are some of the things that I think like uh, you know animate his critique of the individual.
But I think that's super interesting because I think for me, mm, I mean, as I read the text, I mean, obviously we're starting in psychiatry, right? So that's where we're kind of that's where we are at I mean, that's where we're coming from, and that's where we will go back to. Um, but it is interesting because I think there are many elements, and I mean, maybe we will learn more as we go. But the argument that he makes, as I understand it in a certain sense, is that, of course, I mean, I think maybe individual isn't in a sense, the word he should be using, and maybe it's exactly the word he should be using. I don't know, but he builds up a kind of image argument, whatever, where you can kind of see that okay, disciplinary power, and then we go all the way back to kind of ascesis, and we can kind of trace this back, and we can arrive in a sense at. I mean, I don't know the history of ascesis in Judaism, but obviously not as rich as in Christianity. Um, but of course, there is something, and then he traces this kind of ascesis, the beginnings of disciplinary power, and all these things. They are, of course, in a certain way, I think, the forces that create an individual as we understand an individual today. And then he goes on to say this kind of juridico-philosophical kind of part of it, and the disciplinary part on the other hand. Like you have all the individual rights and all these things on one side, and the kind of humanist side of all of it. Uh, it's just I don't know. It, for me, it is interesting where he lands here because I feel there's so many ways of maybe reading Foucault, as you were talking about earlier, Luke. Like, and also often I think in relation to Deleuze and Guattari, where kind of desubjectification or kind of um, a clear escape from the individual, I think, is often or from individuality is kind of it's I mean like, I mean, what is it Deleuze and Guattari, for example, at some point says in Mille Plateau? I mean, they say uh, if there is such a thing as a destiny for humanity, it is to escape the face or some shit like that. They say, like, I mean, they even go to the length of saying that, okay, but that should be our destiny, to escape the face and to escape the machine of faciality or something like this. So I mean, I don't know if we can, maybe there's a different way into this kind of, in which we can think of it differently. Um, I mean, one way maybe is to think about, okay, but are there any, we talked about that the other session, I felt, with, okay, but are we still in a kind of society of discipline, or are we, are there, again, now, as Foucault kind of says earlier, like, okay, there are early on, like Middle Ages, even earlier, there are these islands of disciplinary power in the monasteries and all these things, right? But you have the kind of sovereign power all around elsewhere. And I don't know. I'm just throwing a lot of shit out now, I feel, but
Well, so
it is it. Yeah.
Deleuze is actually a really good way in, right? Because so at this point in time, Foucault and Deleuze are like really close, They're compadres, like and but you can see here the beginning of what really only manifests itself in the sequel to Discipline and Punish, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, about which Deleuze and Foucault have a huge falling out, disagreement, and they don't speak again. They never speak again. Now, what's useful about that is that Foucault dies in the most ironic and tragic circumstances. Can come to a different point. And Deleuze is devastated that he never managed to, or had a chance to reconcile with Foucault. That this disagreement was a deep wound for Deleuze. So immediately following Deleuze's death, Foucault's death, Deleuze spends 1 or 2 years of seminars on Foucault that I think have been recently translated. I haven't actually read them yet. However, what I have read is the condensation of those seminars. So very much in the way that Foucault's seminars become books, so did the seminars of Deleuze. And in the seminars of Deleuze, he kind of gives this epithet to Foucault, the master of the archive. And it's his mode of reconciliation, his mode of trying to abate or absolve himself of what he realizes is a great injustice that he's done to Foucault. The Deleuze himself recognizes that he was mistaken. Foucault was also mistaken. They were both mistaken. It's one of those kind of, I don't know, it often happens in relationships, right? It's like, I fucked up, you fucked up, we both fucked up. Our fuck ups became a kind of, helioscopic spiral of fuck ups. I mean, certainly in my life, that's how things tend to go. But so Deleuze tries to do this, and he gives this title of Master of the Archive. Now, Patrick mentioned before something about writing and the importance of kind of transcription, right? And specifically in the French context. I think that's also something that's important about Foucault, is that he is very much, although his ideas are of global import, he's very much, right up until I think the 77-78 lecture series, within the French context, within French literature, although he is although he can speak English, German, French, And although, whilst he apologizes constantly for his Latin and ancient Greek, he is more than a competent reader and scholar of both. Now, the point being that maybe as both, well, I don't know how you'll take it, but if you think that Deleuze gives him this kind of epithet, master of the archive, and then if you think, well, what is Foucault's source material here? Well, it is precisely documents, it is precisely text, it is precisely transcriptions, and that offers something like a clue to the epistemological plane that we will at some point arrive. Because within the text, everything is, in a sense, already over. It's already always foreclosed. And there's something intimate here about the French language itself, and that manifests itself in an object form in French cities, for example. So in French cities, everything is kind of ordered and regulated. Every space is demarcated. Every space is governed by a particular set of rules that constitute acceptability. Now, of course, there are moments of suspension of those rules, right? So Agamben, a great reader of Foucault, kind of, the big idea of sovereignty that dominates political theory, for example, comes from Carl Schmitt, right? And it's this notion that the sovereign is he who has a monopoly over legitimate violence, right? So what constitutes the sovereign for Schmitt is the act of violence in its legitimate, acceptable form. So like the police officer, the soldier, etc. 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 The teacher, and Foucault, of course, talks about the importance, the kind of ironic bodily importance of the attendants, the medical attendants in the context of Mad King George, and how although he uses this scene as a kind of theatrical illustration of the emergence of disciplinary power, he does know without resolving the paradox that nonetheless this disciplinary power is still constituted and enforced by an act of violence. And so you can see how there are all just so many layers and threads, complexities that haven't yet been woven into a fabric. Right? However, Agamben, who, he's this guy who's kind of got one idea, right? He's got one idea, and it's a really good one. But Agamben is a reader of Foucault. So Agamben reads Foucault, and he takes Foucault's works, and he kind of revolutionizes this notion of sovereignty for Schmitt. So if you imagine for Schmitt, there is a kind of order and a kind of legitimacy, and then something that might be considered an interruption to that legitimacy is nonetheless included of it in a state of monopolization by the sovereign and his delegates, let's say, or people to whom he delegates legitimate power, in this sense violence, right? Whereas Agamben says, no, the sovereign is not he who can and if anyone is switching off in the the use of he, well, for most of Western history, the sovereign, at least formally considered, has been he. I mean that would be a long digression. But so for Agamben, sovereignty is not the monopolization of legitimate violence. Sovereignty is not a series of rules in which violence is able to be exercised in a way that is acceptable. Rather, sovereignty is the state of exception. Sovereignty is where the rules become suspended, and the sovereign then is the person who can say the rules no longer apply. A perfect example of which would be the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Right? So, the notion, there's that Israel are trying to in their, I mean the just trickery that they're trying to pull, the sudden emergence of like a legalism that applies nowhere else, you know. Like, no one had a problem of saying that. I don't know how many people died in the genocide that occurred in the Balkans, but it was less than, I think it was less than 1,000. And anyway, you know, the number does not count. You know, the number's irrelevant. But the way that they try to appeal to a kind of legalism, and you know, like squeeze their way out of what I think the inevitable conclusion of the court will be, that they have committed an act of genocide. And if they don't reach that conclusion, I think what is absolutely inescapable is crimes against humanity and war crimes. And I think a real turning point in that discussion in the contemporary moment has been the discovery of the video footage of the ambulances. You know, in the original explanation of the IDF, oh, they approached us suspiciously and they didn't have da 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 da. And then you have the video where they have their flashing lights on, and then you have this absolute monstrous pig of a stooge or patsy, you know, who claims to have fled England, you know, to the safety of Israel because of the virulent anti-Semitism. It's like, well, I wonder what the source of that anti-Semitism might be. Oh, it might be precisely the maneuver that the radical right wing of Israel have been trying, and quite successfully, to pull for the past decade or 20 years, in which Israeli is equivalent to Jewishness and Jewishness is equivalent to Israeli, which of course it is not. I mean, there was incredible footage that's not displayed at all in the West. For example, of anti kind of let's say military operations as they exist at the moment in Gaza, protesters, Jewish Israelis protesting in Israel, and the brutality with which they are treated by their fellow Jewish Israelis is really something remarkable to see. And the fact that it hasn't been reported is incredible. And then to see this pig of a man, this disgusting man, get up on stage and try in and through legalism and in and through, it's just the most basic form of trickery. You know, he's saying that, oh, you know, well, you know, we know that it's Hamas, you know, that that Hamas use, you know, the ambulances to transport themselves, and they abuse the protections of international law. And it's like, that isn't the issue in question, dickhead. The issue in question is that the IDF have lied and have been caught lying, and have, with documentary indisputable evidence and proof to anyone with a pair of eyes, been caught in a lie. So, Agamben, the sovereign is he who does not have regulated control over the application of violence, of legitimate violence. Rather, the sovereign is he who can suspend the rules such that all hell is let loose, as happened in Gaza. Again, you know, something that's remarkable in the lack of coverage in the Western media is what's happening in Sudan at the moment. Of course, we hear a lot about Ukraine because that fits in with, you know, whoever is setting the agenda for Western media. You know, certainly a set of rules apply to Ukraine that do not apply to Sudan and that do not apply to Gaza. But just to bring that point back to where it might be useful epistemologically, is that Foucault is reading texts, and texts always have this status of foreclosure. That status of foreclosure is very typical of French culture, the French bureaucracy, the French language. It manifests itself in an objectified form. Even in French parks, the trees have fences around them. Even trees cannot be something to lean upon and take shade underneath. Even fucking trees have to be in some way contained and regulated and ordered. And so, yeah, so I think that by just having that thought in your head of the master of the archive, that the object of his study is not the individual in the normative sense that you've latched onto, or the materiality of the classroom, of mischief, of hijinks, of points of reversal that Patrick latched onto. The object of Foucault's study is the text. And the problem that he's going to go on to try and resolve is precisely this question that Wittgenstein does not resolve, but rather provides a way out of so beautifully, which is the relationship between words and things, which of course is Foucault's first work, by the way, Les mots et les choses, which is always strangely translated as the order of things, when I just think words and things would be a much, much better translation. So there is, in a sense, if you just focus on that notion, that the object of his study here, though it appears to us as the things about which he talks, it's rather the way in which they are talked about, and the particular way in which that talk is inscribed in the form of text, the document, writing, the dossier.
Oh, it's interesting, yeah. I've got something just to say quickly about this idea of, okay, the sovereign power is that which can like exempt itself from the law at any moment and without offering some kind of like formal or official excuse or reason. And like this exemption from law or the rules of the game is often unleashed as a kind of like almost like, you know, limitless violence, you know, a moment of kind of unaccountable slaughter. And I just thought how that's juxtaposed with the inaugural moment and mythological beginning of disciplinary power, which precisely begins as kind of pacifism, you know, on the one hand, with Pinel, you know, releasing the inmates from their shackles and binds, and this kind of act of, weirdly, it is also an act of sovereign power because so like you almost need this moment of sovereign power in order to get out of the dynamic of sovereign power, because if you think that the sovereign has kind of rights of limitless, you know, an unqualified right of life and death over the subjects, then only the sovereign can be truly merciful, you know. Only the sovereign can pardon, like, you know, with the officially in law, like, you know, the king's pardon, things like that, and also unofficially as the deputy of God, you know, especially in like Christian monarchies, the king is the one who can be merciful. So Pinel, in rescuing and kind of like redeeming the inmates of the dungeons in that mythological opening, comes down on the pacifistic side of sovereignty, on the side of mercy, on the side of forgiveness, on the side of pardon. Secondly, everything that's done in and through disciplinary power takes the form of following law, following protocol, abiding the rules. Okay, like the police officer, you know, the first police officer you go in and see when you've been arrested. Okay, you stand up at the desk and so on. Now that person has no emotion obligations to, even if they feel emotional towards you, they can maybe crack a joke. You know, they can give you a pat on the head and so on. But they are kind of like a merciless agent of the rules, of protocol, of law, you know. If you need to be strip searched, they'll strip search you, you know. If you need to be locked up for 20, if they get a kind of order to lock you up for 20 hours, you'll be locked up for 20 hours, you know. So I think that's like quite a nice way to juxtapose both of these two forms of power. And so Luke kind of illustrated sovereignty at its worst, you know, in the form of, you know, this kind of like pig-headed and kind of ugly exemption, or self-exemption in the case of genocide, you know, or war crimes, or just kind of like, you know, yeah, monstrous cruelty. But then there's another side of sovereignty where it's like that's summed up in that idea of founding precedents, where, how should I put it, the emotional, like you know, go back to the scenario of the police officer who's taking your name and so on. The carrying out the law would be sort of inseparable from and indistinguishable from precisely that relationship of intimacy. Okay, so I don't know how to put it, but uh, the relationship between the baron and his serfs is precisely one of intimacy. Like either the baron is the one who goes out and he'll whip like the kind of the serf who's not doing his work or has not paid his debts and so on, or who's been skiving or who's been kind of like playing the role of agitator and whipping up the other serfs into a kind of like revolt against him. And that whipping again is this moment of intimacy. Or he'll be the one who goes out into the fields and is kind of convivial and is kind of raconteur and this master of the revels, slapping everyone on the shoulder, giving someone a little bit of money to help them out for this week, or uh, there's a young kid in one of the families who's shown a kind of like precocity in mathematics, and he hires a tutor to go and teach him. That there are just these endless possibilities for intimate connections to then morph themselves or evolve themselves into customs and conventions, which you don't have in disciplinary, under disciplinary power. Right? You just have, in its worst form, the following of rules, protocols, principles, uh, codes of conduct, regulations, which can make, I don't know how to put this, but it can constitute the appeal, weirdly, of people like Trump, who's like, who at least in his persona makes himself out to be precisely this kind of old baron character who's surrounded by, not by the best in the business, but by people he can trust, his friends, his entourage, and who can go up to a man in the street and talk to him one on one and be like, you know what, I saw that thing out for you, even that the use of a certain kind of idiomatic language, and a certain tone of voice that disciplinary power never permits itself, because disciplinary power must always be official, you know, according to the letter and so on. Right, Trump's like very tone and his vernacular is a bit like you'd bumped into him at a bus stop or something, or whilst walking down the road, or at the gentleman's club, or whatever it is. Um, yeah, so I'm just because in Foucault you do also see this fascination with sovereign power, almost like an affection for sovereign power, a craving for it or something, as a sense that there's something beautiful about it that's just not present any longer in disciplinary power. Maybe we can start talking about, in relation to that, this thing that Foucault calls constant punishment, and we kind of we dipped into a little bit last week, this idea of preemptive punishments. So that if sovereign power takes the form of kind of gorgeous, fabulous, and spectacular real punishments, executions, being hung and or being caught, drawn and quartered, or the other stuff that Luke read out last week, having the back skin of your thighs plucked off with red hot pincers, then disciplinary power takes this kind of unspectacular, insidious, almost invisible form of micro punishments or preventative measures, or as Foucault puts it, moral orthopedics. What did you guys think about that?
I mean, I think I was just wondering, um, and maybe this, this is, I don't know, like in some way, I want to hear some more from Jakob, like as the the most monastic of three, but very much,
Or maybe not. Maybe
but
not.
very much an individual, and through his. Oh well, yeah, things have changed, eh? But no, I think So this state of kind of um anticipatory punishment constant surveillance. I mean, I don't know. There's almost, we're kind of like losing like a little bit of the sense of the like the psychiatric, and maybe a way to bring all these things together is take it right back to what he kind of begins with, and then he resumes in a more full way here, which can be expressed in a simple way, that it is not the case that the clinical knowledge constitutes the subject in the sense of classification or reality or object as mad. So, so it is not that there is a clinical speculation or, a series of kind of analyses that result in an object such as schizophrenia or mania or hysteria or psychosis. Rather, it is the relationship of power that precedes and constitute the possibility of the medical knowledge, which will then be used as justification for that relationship of power. I don't know. I think I was just trying to, in some way, bring Jakob's like kind of rich thought and reading in psychiatry and psychoanalysis into the source, which naturally in the the history of psychiatry from the 19th to the 20th century is very much a case of these moral orthopedics. So I don't know, I posted something to the group before about Ritalin or Adderall. Now, for anyone who's taken amphetamines, they will know that what a doctor says to you about Adderall or Ritalin, both of them being amphetamines. Amphetamines commonly known as speed, that Germans love, actually invented by the Nazis to, so they could stay awake. A lot of people call speed a shit drug because you only get high like 2 or 3 times and then you're just awake. You just take more and you just stay awake for longer. And the kind of the moral orthopedics typical of, and maybe like later on we'll maybe in the next seminar now talk about the the constraints that Patrick hinted at in the last seminar, in which with each movement of resistance they tighten the gloves or the materiality of the hospital. I don't know. I just wanted to bring in a bit more of both, like Jakob, but also just to maybe get away from these huge issues that obviously these works immediately bring up, and to kind of maybe like reground ourselves a little bit in the psychiatric and psychoanalytic context, and maybe it could be useful for if you still wanted to kind of go in this way, to resituate that as not a kind of generalized problematic, but one peculiar to, I don't know, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, mind, hospital, treatment, sedation, medication. I mean, I don't know if that's something that would be where you'd like to go, but I mean, I'd find that interesting and maybe a way to kind of.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, what I think maybe I'm not sure if I'm really understanding your question, to be honest. But what I do get from the text, and maybe this is why it seems so big, is that he's beginning to hint at things that are like fucking massive, and also he does so in a kind of language that I think, in many ways, is, at least for me right now as I read it, it is confusing, because there are many ways where he literally says things and then he kind of contradicts himself half a page ever so slightly later. But like, for example, in the sense of psychiatry, I mean, he does, even though these, like at least chapter 3 and 4, they aren't very concretely psychiatric, right? I mean, he does the whole where we started, like the sovereign disciplinary power, and then he goes over to panopticon, and then he does what, like the family stuff later on. Um, but I think what, for me at least, what comes up is this kind of, and maybe we shouldn't talk about it because it's very easy to get stuck. But I mean, for example, he writes something like this, where he talks about the kind of panoptic character of disciplinary power. And then he says, like, to summarize the second aspect of disciplinary power, which we could call the panoptic character of disciplinary power, the absolute and constant visibility surrounding the bodies of individuals, I think we could say the following. The panoptic principle, seeing everything, everyone, all the time, organizes a genetic polarity of time. It proceeds towards a centralized individualization, the support and instrument of which is writing. And finally, it involves a punitive and continuous action on potential behavior that behind the body itself projects something like a psyche. So I don't know where, I mean, we can go in many, I mean, this, I find just this paragraph is like, it's very rich with shit, and there's so many things going on, kind of, right? But one idea that a kind of smaller idea that he does return to is this idea of a kind of superego, right? He says it like this in this sentence. He says, project something like a psyche. And I'm not sure if I understand, because he says this twice, I think, in this lecture. And I'm not sure if I'm following him. And maybe psyche has some Greek kind of, connotations, etymology that I'm not familiar with. But or maybe he's referencing some specific French psychoanalytic thing that is going on at the moment. I don't know. But it is a kind of crazy statement, right? To then say, okay, but what is he actually understanding here? Like, is he understanding that the kind of, I think he calls them psi functions later on, like psychiatry, psychoanalysis, like all this kind of psychological, all the psychological sciences, sociological stuff that he kind of calls them, right? He bundles them together and says, like, oh, this kind of psychological understanding of man, it does this thing where it projects this psyche. And psychoanalysts, of course, they would not really agree with what he's saying. I mean, I don't know what they would say, but different things, of course. But um, I mean, I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you think of this thing, because I think psychoanalysis has also kind of advanced now and taken a lot of Foucault's thought, kind of developed it, and even how, I mean, for psychoanalysis is incredibly marginal, right? At this moment, it's like a very little fringe activity. But the benefit of that is that it has become very intellectual, and that, people are taking up Foucault, they're taking up all kinds of people, and yeah, it's a long time since Lacan also was very active. So there's a moment now to do a lot of interesting things with psychoanalysis. But yeah, I'll stop there. I'm just curious about what you think of this little aspect.
Well, just one tiny thing, I think, like to think that this idea of panopticon, because what I thought as well, when I was reading, the panopticon functions basically by inducing paranoia. Okay, the constant fear that, for example, exactly at the moment when you're weak or exposed or committing some minor misdemeanor or crime, that someone is looking at you. Okay, so it, I think like that, if we're gonna make, I don't think there's any like secret, you know, uh, conjuring or of the etymology of the Greek word in Psi. I think he's just literally taking it up from discourses contemporary with him and like in the last several centuries, because the psyche in Greek is a much richer term than that.
Hmm.
And he seems to be deliberately pinpointing a sort of a thin version of the psyche, okay, that manifests itself precisely in and through this kind of paranoia. So that then, I mean, again, I'm just riffing here, but then if you imagine that there is a paranoia induced by the disciplinary apparatus itself, specifically modeled and like perfectly exemplified and illustrated in the panopticon, then every attempt, sorry, then you can imagine almost like the conscience. Think about how similar in structure, how symmetric the idea of paranoia is to having a conscience. Having a conscience is basically like an externalized kind of eye that's constantly looking at you and judging you, and like kind of like scrupulously enumerating your sins and faults, and moments of distraction and disobedience and things like that. So if the thing that we call psyche and study in the disciplines of psychology and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis actually has as its founding moment, and like genealogical fulcrum, this paranoia that we experience in disciplinary societies, then it's kind of untrustworthy, as a source of truth about ourselves. Uh, it's only a source of truth about this particular form of the individual that comes into existence when we start to experience kind of mass and omnipresent surveillance. Okay. So it's an effect or an epiphenomena, arising from particular kind of like social or political conditions. Now, I don't, again, I like definitely don't think that means that like all forms of the psyche are debased and corrupt. And I don't think like Foucault means that either. That's why he has this weird kind of like flirty camp play with these terms like psi function.
Mm.
There's a deliberate attempt almost to be kind of burlesque and cabaret there, by choosing an obviously ugly term, when he has the ability to choose, a sexier or more sassy one. He chooses this psi function again, like a kind of parody of the scholastic or a parody of the academic. And I imagine him like picking up terms like that and then just using them and then forgetting about them next week. I don't know if this term psi function is going to come back, but I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't play a central role. Like maybe it does, I don't know, but that's.
I mean, I've never heard it. Yeah, I agree.
But basically just that's my reading of that paragraph that you just mentioned.
Mm.
Uh, and you do, like, I don't know, isn't it like, think about cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the things that happens when you do cognitive behavioral therapy is that you do feel kind of like cramped, cribbed, circumscribed by all the exercises that they force you to commit yourself to,
Mm.
almost like as if you're getting further entrenched, and sequestered and stranded in your illness. And I think that's the thing that Foucault is seeing again and again. The very things that we're calling therapy, cure, are actually just further entrenchments and radicalizations of the illness. And one of his explanations of that is that the thing that we study as psyche is actually born under these political conditions in a state of paranoia induced by disciplinary society, by the kind of like, the panoptic dimension of disciplinary society. Anyway, that's what I think he's
Mm.
saying.
No, I mean, but I think what is interesting with that is that I think the difficult thing for me to reconcile at this moment, and yeah, we will for sure return to that, right? Where he kind of goes on to say, and maybe at some moment I also think maybe like the master of the archives is a good title for him because I don't think he is a therapeutic master in any sense. So maybe we can let him be in the archives instead of the real clinic. But mm, like because I mean my intuition is that there are so many of these like monastic practices. I mean, at some moment he says this quite uh, very simple thing. Let's see if I can find it. Uh, oh yeah, here we go. Uh, again, this was a short one, but I think it's interesting. Disciplinary power refers instead to a final or optimum state. It looks forward to the future, towards the moment when it will keep going by itself and only a virtual supervision will be required, when discipline consequently will have become habit. And I think, I don't know, I mean, there are just so many like of the kind of ascetic monastic practices uh, that bleed together with therapeutic practices, like psychotherapeutic practices, and where I think, I don't know who has, I can't remember who introduces this term. It might be, I don't know if it's a French term originally translated to English or what it is, but a lot today I feel people in psychoanalysis speak about binding and unbinding, which I think it really is. I mean, it's a post-structuralist kind of debt in a sense. And my intuition is that, I mean, all these kind of things, the kind of recounting of one's personal biography, one's history, the habit formation, the kind of, to some degree, self-supervision and the loneliness that all this kind of acquires. I mean, to me, all of these things, if not overdone and done in excess so that, you know, you go mad, kind of, they serve to kind of bind an individual's psyche together, right? If you somehow start, like, I mean, acid, you know, we've had a proper acid experience, and at some point I felt what was my biography, you know, my previous life history, and I thought that was a kind of interesting moment because, or this is why I get hung up with this thing that he's saying about disciplinary power, because I think there are so many components of disciplinary power, um, or you know, discipline in the wide sense, that actually does produce what in psychoanalysis you would call the ego, or the mechanism to bind things together, to assimilate them into your own biography, uh, and to kind of keep track of space and time in a certain sense. Of course, it becomes particular in particular societies, but this is why I get a bit hung up on his idea with the individual, because I think there is a lot of truth to it. The question is just what we related to. I don't know what other options we're talking about. You know, I mean, he kind of just says this thing that, um, yeah, that in a sense the individual is invented, and then we're like, yeah, and I mean, maybe I don't know to what degree, you know, you could actually say that through discipline, through therapy, through all these kind of things that happens in what he says is disciplinary society, also a concrete sense of individuality is produced. I mean, it's very different, and maybe that's, as an academic, maybe that's completely uninteresting because it's such a thing to, it's so big that you cannot handle it. I don't know, even if Foucault kind of seems to be able to handle it in this lecture.
Well,
I'll
I mean,
stop.
maybe
It's many threads, yeah.
maybe just consider again the object of his analysis, and just, I don't know. So I'll tell you something in a moment. Because I'm conscious of time, conscious of something else, starting to feel a bit hungry. uh, um, but okay, so this is about the strange epistemological status of his writings at this moment. Right? At this moment where he's kind of, although he renders things with such, you know, grandiloquence and magnificence, and they do, you know, like hit you like a, you know, you're like, wow. I mean, you know, the way that he ends this lecture is just. However, the object of his analysis is not the thing the writing circumscribed and the kind of designatory quality of writing, insofar as, you know, the individual designates this thing that we now call the individual, understand as the individual. In our context, experience is the individual. It's the individual in as much as the actual object of his study at this point is the text, is the archive. So a way to think about this is in and through British names, right? And especially two of the most common ones. One, Smith. Why are there so many people called Smith? Because the person at a time, some centuries ago, blacksmith. Thus their surname would be Smith, John Smith and Son, Steve Smith and Son. Now that doesn't mean that they led a rich social life outside of their subject function, right? Which is what he talks about in this lecture. Their subject function within this context of a certain order of society in which a certain thing needs to be produced. The thing needing to be reduced requires a certain kind of mastery of a number of techniques. Those techniques themselves requiring a period of apprenticeship, right? Which he kind of brings up in this what is it in the third lecture. So if the object of Foucault's analysis at this point is the text, right? Of course, and you have to remember as well that Foucault considers Flaubert to be the greatest author. And what does Flaubert introduce as a possibility of expression into the text? Precisely the dominant form, what has become the dominant form of culture now, which is realism, right? I mean, of course, there is like fantasy, so fantasy's big, superhero films are big, but really the biggest form of culture since Flaubert has been realism. And what does Flaubert introduce as a kind of possibility of expression? Well, he introduces, the story of like some banal bourgeois housewife, not a king, not a ruler, not a kind of tragic figure, not someone destined for, not the person who was born in rags but was destined to in some way to be a king. All of his subjects, with perhaps the notable exception of Salammbô, are people who exist like outside of the text. So, John Smith, Pete Smith, Steve Smith might all have very diverse, rich social lives, yet those lives never materialize themselves in text. And so therefore are kind of foreign at this moment to Foucault's object of analysis, which is not the John Smith behind the text. Rather, on the one hand, the subject function that does exist within the text, and then this form of power that he can see emerging through which the individual body, right? And that's why he has this, this kind of like oscillating paradoxical, that he states himself is a paradox with bodies. Because really what he's talking about is the Smith as a function as it exists in the text. So the other thing is that I fucked this up, the stream, so we didn't actually start streaming at the start.
Okay.
I only noticed after I'd come back for a piss.
Really? That's the only way that anyone actually saw.
No, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to upload it like immediately afterwards.
But you have recorded it.
Yeah, no, I've recorded it, and then I kind of, a bit after I'd noticed, I went live, but I didn't want to say because, the kind of put us all into some kind of, like strange disarray. I think the live format is important, but I'm still just getting to grips with like the technical side, and I didn't realize that when I was like start broadcast, there was also like go live. These two things are the same. So I clicked on one and didn't click on the other. But I will upload it. But I think we in some way, in order to progress, and this is part of the thing and part of the whole reason for the format, part of the reason why we're doing it live, part of the reason for the reading is to like have to kind of grapple and wrestle with these notions, and this specific kind of epistemological plane is where most people get stuck with Foucault. It's where most people kind of they either end up trying to resolve it and get stuck in the trap, or they're just like, well, this is for ABC and ABC reasons. This is kind of bullshit and therefore should be dismissed. So I'll think about it for the next seminar. If we could all try to get up to the 6th lecture, at least in reading, because once we're past that midpoint, like when he, I kind of mentioned it, I think on a Facebook post. I mean, there are these just magnificent scenes where he talks about the doctor's logs of women who have been admitted to psychiatric hospitals with mania, and he basically he uses these logs, these moments, and these are precisely moments where the individual manifests themselves not in their individuality, neither in their subject moment, but in a relationship of confrontation and joust. And then if we go right back to the first lecture, where there's this introduction of the person into the psychiatric hospital, and this is, by the way, the kind of how would you describe it, like the blueprint for the first psychiatric hospital, the imagination of the person who conceived of this institution, right? They conceived of this spectacular entrance into the hospital, and then described all of these qualities and characteristics of the doctor. And so that's when, and so he both positions it there more clearly, but then later on he will go on to talk about this joust or moment of confrontation, because what then is the psychiatric hospital trying to do? Well, it's trying to impose upon the patient a particular notion of reality, right? A particular kind of order, a particular sense of normativity, a particular way of being. And the disciplinary and the individual, in which we're kind of like trapped at the moment, is in a sense incidental, and it's the bookends that become more important. And so in this moment later on that we will get to, he talks about these women and how what they do is they kind of enact these incredible scenes of hysteria and mania that are lascivious, that are seductive, and they're essentially trying to drag the doctor out of their subject function, to drag them into a space of kind of individuality where they are not replaceable, where they are not merely a kind of node or relay of power. And so that space might be a kind of point of escape. I have to think about it a bit more. But I think yeah, it's just important at this moment that we don't that we don't get trapped in this thing. And then as well, it's very, like I said, it's very difficult for me because I kind of have the answer, the revelation of which is already there, it's already available, it's already in my thesis. But you have to kind of arrive there, in and through the struggle, And so to do so, it involves a certain, maybe to use your terminology, Jakub, certain unbinding. Like a certain a letting go of, because of course it does, like it hits like a like an anvil, like being struck to the side of the head with a hammer. Especially in our present moment. But yeah, I think because we are talking about the lectures, at least lectures at least at first, that were written as lectures, that were delivered as lectures, and that took part in that present moment. I don't know, maybe a bit more consideration of that. I did talk about it a bit in the last seminar. That really what he was saying at this point, right? Because I mean, even the just this very idea. Okay, so in my notes, I kind of had a couple of starred things, and one of them was this when he talks about power as capillary, and the trajectory is very clear and very demonstrable between Foucault's notion of micro power and the movement of feminism now fading away of microaggression. Micro power in and through Judith Butler, who is a big reader of Foucault, and then she takes that to this notion of gender as fluid, sexuality as performance, right? And so much of our contemporary moment is made in and through misunderstandings and misreadings, in my view, of Foucault's work. And the trajectory of that is very clear. So a lot of the kind of like dogmatic and angry nature of the trans movement, for example, its censorious nature, tendency to banish, to exiled, a lot of that comes again from a kind of misunderstanding of Foucault's work. And it was interesting because I'm like curious about this guy, Mark Fisher, who's the guy who wrote Capitalist Realism, and the kind of like major I don't know, like keeper in a way of his works, or certainly his kind of later works published after his suicide and all sorts. He's a guy called Luc Colquhoun, I think, and Luc Colquhoun is trans. And I was reading Luc Colquhoun's blog, which
Matt,
is absolutely brilliant. What's that? Is it Matt Colquhoun?
I think so.
I think it is Colquhoun though. Colquhoun.
Yeah, Matt. Yeah.
Matt. Yeah. So like, interesting guy. And there's there was just something about when he was locating someone who identifies as a trans male. I mean, I don't know what his kind of specific politics vis-a-vis that are, but to me they're kind of irrelevant. Like, his work's good, and a lot of the kind of foundational and constitutional literature of the contemporary trans movement like directly references Foucault's work and brings up Foucault. So then there's this kind of like strange chasm, right, between this present moment where Foucault is inescapable. I mean, who doesn't use the word discourse, which before Foucault was like a non-word? Who doesn't use that word or that term? And when people use that term, they use it in precisely a Foucauldian sense. You can't say, oh, well, there were people who said the word discourse before. No. When people talk about discourse, they talk precisely about a kind of a regulated form of speech, a form of speech that's like allowed to circulate in a certain way that has like certain rule, like you can, yeah. I mean, so yeah, I think I'll think a bit to try and get out of this aporia. However, I think that this moment that he will come to, where there is this joust and confrontation between the female patient who is diagnosed as hysteric or manic, and how she goes to the kind of furthest reaches of sex and sexuality, to the very depths of perversity, in order to try and drag the doctor precisely out of their subject function. And then maybe that brings us to something that Patrick was talking about, which was moments of intimacy and connection. In a dual sense, both because a lot of forms of, say, perversity, masochism, sadism, are precisely a kind of extreme form of a yearning for intimacy or connection, right, in and of themselves. And then their deployment in the context of the psychiatric hospital by the women is precisely to try and drag these doctors from their subject function into what you might normatively describe as their individuality.
Mm. Yeah, well, that'll be good. That sounds like a very rich feast day of a lesson. Is that next week?
No, like, so I'm gonna,
in the future
let's,
somewhere. I mean, I thought of loads of things to say there, but I just how long do we go on?
I
One
mean,
thing, one thing I
yeah.
just thought, maybe it's for another time, but what I find bizarre about that the sort of microaggression movement is that lots of the sort of the tactic strategies that are deployed for calling out microaggressions seem to me to resemble precisely those maneuvers that we see practiced by the agents of disciplinary power, you know. So, like, again, not to just keep banging on the same thing, but it's an easy thing for me to go to. But like, well, even the psychiatric scenario, what is taken as evidence of like the persistent madness, recalcitrant madness, incurable madness, was precisely things that you might call microaggressions, you know, like, so, someone not taking his pills, someone being rude to a nurse, who has a prominent position in the ward. These are all taken as forms of microaggression and therefore as kind of like evidence that the person is still mad, that they still haven't been, properly, they still haven't properly subjected themselves to the process of cure. Or in the classroom, for example, rolling your eyes at a teacher, kissing your teeth, you know, these are all taken as forms of microaggression and therefore are kind of classified and punished under that system of, preventative measures and preemptive micro punishments. So I just thought like that, you talk about a misunderstanding, but there's almost like a weird kind of inversion and a use of Foucault to serve as alibi precisely for the actions of disciplinary power that he was attempting to analyze, dissect and expose. Right? So that's one thing, yeah. Second thing is this really interesting thing that Luke was talking about, like happening in Madame Bovary, like you mentioned Madame Bovary, and the individual was basically like the topic and subject of novels. Okay, and I thought of another thing that, and linking together with something that you said, Jakob, like about the idea of biography, as a therapeutic practice. Okay, and I was thinking, like, one of like the sort of like again, it's not exactly in Foucault, but one of the origins of, well, actually, it is in Foucault. Yeah, it is. It's there in the idea of the brothers of the common life, or what it's called, and the fact that um, the disciplinary power kind of adapts and incorporates for ascetic practices it finds in the monastery and places like that, where it's this the kind of like hegemony of Puritanism, the rise to power of Puritanism, the emergence of Puritanism as kind of like the mode of moral conduct par excellence. And one of the origins of like the modern individual is precisely through what are called spiritual autobiographies in like Puritanism of like the 15th, 16th century, in which the goal was precisely to kind of scrupulously, mercilessly write down absolutely everything that happened during your day. And the justification for this was that God sees everything and also God made everything. So therefore, the particular gesture or word that you used when talking to your wife that morning had a kind of a power and authority as much as the gospel did, or as much as the priest's word did.
Mm.
And the kind of like the motto for this, extreme attentiveness to the minutiae of life is from Luther, every day is baptism. This idea that don't no not that we're not going to like be like the Catholic Church and kind of pay tribute and overemphasize these moments of initiation or rites of passage or ritual or mass. Every single moment of every single day is God's handiwork and therefore must be appreciated. Second strand that I want to bring into that, and I just thought of this moment, all of the big, well, 80% of the big early novels, yeah, are centered on a character who wants to, who either deludedly thinks they're pure or who wants to keep themselves pure against a world that continually tries to sabotage, corrupt, entice, or seduce them. So, like, think about something like, I don't know, the Henry Fielding, Shyamala and Joseph Andrews, Tom Jones, Pamela from Samuel Richardson. What else was I going to say? Fuck, I had another good one as well. Anyway, obviously the parody and late burlesque and like philosophical form of this is the Sad and Justine, you know, where like, it's a moment of heroic puritanism when Justine, you know, gets kind of kidnapped, taken into the lair of the libertines, and subjected to kind of like sexual mortification at the hands of the local bishop and the chief of police. But she goes away ecstatic and delighted because they only came over her face and breasts, and therefore her hymen remained intact, So that
Mm.
this is like a moment of jubilation for her, And I think there is this like fundamental link between Puritanism on the one hand and the construction of a modern self, a modern selfhood or modern individuality. Never mind, like there are a wealth of different forms of individuality. I'm not denying that, but there's
Mm.
one form which has to do with is constructed by disciplinary power, both through its like the late form of the regiments that are put in place in schools or police stations or in asylums or whatever, uh, and also in its early form in novels, like the construction of this or spiritual autobiography. Um, I was thinking as well. Another one is like Pilgrim's Progress as well. There's also a narrative about someone who tries to remain pure, and
Mm.
there's just loads of them. Like Gulliver's Travels is a kind of ironic version of it because Gulliver remains pure in the sense that he learns nothing. Like, or Candide by Voltaire. Candide wants to persist in his belief that he's living in the best of all possible worlds, even though he sees famine, plagues, catastrophes, war, selfishness, poverty. He wants to keep hold of this fantasy that he's living in the best of all possible worlds. So, like, yeah, no, I just feel like that goes with the other stuff. Was that?
I mean, but Luke, how do you feel about that? Because I feel I struggle. Like it would be maybe we can wait. Maybe we should wait to the sixth lecture or whatever it is. But I mean, if you see the kind of approach that maybe both me and Patrick a bit differently now are taking to the text as potentially a trap or like something that will just, in a sense, make us misunderstand the text. I mean, I'm very down to understand what the fuck this thing of the because I'm not understanding. Like I don't see a different way of reading the text right now, and it would be very interesting to see what this other proposal is kind of. I think I mean we can wait, but it's also one of these things that I'm like, wow. I mean, why not? Why not get into it? Not now, but in the next seminar or something like this.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll both try and prepare something then.
Yeah. Because if you think of this as a kind of entrapped or trapped way of reading Foucault, I mean, I'm very interested in, okay, but then what's the proposal? Like what is the proposal? And is it also so? I mean, I might add that can we also say that he thinks of it differently at this point, or does his understanding also change so that he is? I mean, I don't know how much credit to give him also, you know what I mean? Like maybe he is seriously mistaken about certain things that he then corrects, or I don't know, Um, I know way too little to have a good guess, but it's all super interesting, I feel, to go
Well,
into.
I'd say, oh, okay, so I'd say, and maybe we can kind of close with this. So
Yeah.
I'll think about it, but as a kind of provisional response, what I would say is that we are in the so arguably you can and schematically, and this is also what I'm kind of I'm in my kind of own struggle as well,
Hmm.
with these texts in relationship to my work. But let's just say for now, provisionally and schematically, you can characterize Foucault's work as falling into three distinct periods. So the first is the Foucault who understands us in almost a very Hegelian way, right? In which, and remember that the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, many of them considered any notion of will, any notion of freedom to be absurd and ridiculous. Cause and effect. Now, I have my own kind of like metaphysics in response to this. We don't have to get into them here. But that period of Foucault is one in which, yeah, it's very Hegelian. It's one in which we are just merely the playthings of these. Well, in fact, it's very structuralist in a way. So for example, he begins Les mots et les choses with this magnificent analysis of what's the painting he begins with? I can't believe
the Velasquez painting. Yeah, Velasquez.
Yeah, Velasquez, right?
Osmanino,
so he talks about how this painting manifests all of the possibilities of expression of a particular age of thought, right?
Right.
So in that period, he's very much like, okay, well, there are these structures, and we're just a part of them, and they work through us, and that's kind of that. And then there's this question of, well, why? Okay, and then so he introduces this notion of power, and that becomes his second period, right? We've kind of started in the middle, in a way. Now, this period that he's concerned with power also results in precisely the kinds of problems you've already identified. This might be considered his mid-period, but then in his late period, and this is what I kind of bring out in my thesis, and in the most magnificent way, he again reconstitutes himself and turns to procedures of ascesis and self-fashioning. And yeah, the later Foucault is very different to the mid-Foucault, who is very different to the early Foucault. I think that kind of the best way to really get a sense of the richness and depth of his thought is to kind of be alongside him in his movements and his motion. And then I think that there is such a richness and depth to the sources that he uses, to the kind of periodization he chooses, to the things and the images and the works and texts that he brings up, that they have a kind of value to consider in and of themselves. So I'll have to think a bit more about, the extent to which, because it is an important question, that's raised, and then is it necessary for me, for example, to just go to that later Foucault, kind of drag him into here just for a moment to kind of free us from this thing? Or is there like another way where we can move alongside him? Or, it's something that I'll have to think about before the next seminar. But I think if we could all at least get to lecture 6, and then I'll be I don't even know where I'm going to be. Hopefully, so I'm going to be in London, staying at a hotel, and hopefully they'll have like because the room that I'm staying in, it doesn't have a desk. So I'm either going to be using a side table with the lamp taken off, and like a cushion on the floor, in a kind of like penitent way, maybe that'd be appropriate, absolving myself for my sins, making the sign of the cross, performing some ritual of ablution, down there on the floor, beside the bed, kneeling. Who knows, maybe it will be an appropriate technique de corps, as Marcel Most might put it, Maybe it might be an appropriate body technique for me to revise myself.
Maybe we can all find a bar with Wi-Fi and do like a Greats in Thought hits the streets episode.
Sure.
Yeah. Or pay like a homeless guy to Just
Yeah.
go for a walk, pay two homeless guys, one carrying a boom, the other with a camera, and just kind of, I don't know, walk around the streets of London and see what madness that could bring up. I mean, that might be something
Fucking
quite
hell.
fun, to do
That
at
might be
some
good,
point.
yeah.
Who knows? But yeah, let me think about it, because yeah, like, I'm in my own struggle, and then I'm just very conscious that this is precisely what I wanted to kind of liberate Foucault from, and liberate the reading of him from. But
Yeah,
I
I think
have
we
to,
can manage a way. We'll find a way, yeah.
I just, but yeah, it's just going to take some time and reflection. But I think that's the beauty of the thing of the seminar, and I think this is almost a kind of object example of why this is the format, right? Because, I think it relates to kind of Patrick's the end of the last seminar, where Patrick kind of talked about, it's part of it is the struggle. It's going away and returning. It's revising, reconstituting, refiguring, and in a way, that's precisely what Foucault's doing. That is precisely what he's up to. But how that relates to our present moment, and how we don't get stuck in the way that a lot of people have. We don't result in a place where he's misread or misunderstood in a way that's not useful. Because a misunderstanding can be useful. So, like, for example, I think Voltaire's a fucking idiot. And I think that he completely misunderstands Malebranche. And I think that the whole kind of parody of Malebranche, which is Candide, right? Candide is basically a parody of the philosophy of Malebranche. And I think it's a complete misunderstanding. However, it's kind of a useful one, right? But, even misunderstandings aren't necessarily something to be like thrown in the bin. But I think just in this kind of like relationship of like where there's like a lack of equivalence, right? In terms of knowledge specifically to Foucault, like I have to consider kind of carefully, and just sleep on it a bit and think on it a bit. Like we will get there. I'm certain that we will get there. It's just whether or not, and if so, at what moment and how I perhaps bring in this future possibility that might provide kind of a bit of space, and then allow us to like focus on the kind of richness of the material. Yeah, it just requires some thought.
Yeah, more. Well, we've got all that to look forward to.
But then, like looking kind of further forward, to Triple H plus 2. I mean, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, like.
Oh, that's going to be good, yeah.
Man, I think we all are going to be deep in there. But it's also, and I guess like maybe as a closing comment, unless you have anything else to add, I'd just say that I am like bringing myself back into discipline. Kind of ironically, right? Bringing myself back into kind of the regularity, the reading, even my handwriting. Like I look at my old notebooks, and it's funny. Like you can see the moment when kind of I go back to Oxford and term starts, and my handwriting's a bit scruffy, and then like it steadily becomes like regular, and and then it has like it's never kind of beautiful in a conventional sense, but it's regular and it's readable, and it has like flair and kind of vivacity. I don't know. There's a certain kind of thing going on there that's like interesting to reflect on. And so to confront like Hegel, Hobbes, Hume, Marx, Heidegger, like we're in this for the long haul, and I think to enter into that phase to enter into that source, like wow, we're gonna have to be some strong swimmers.
I'm just going to say as a short parenthesis, this is also something I think is really interesting. I mean, Foucault, I think in this 2 lectures, I think he says it twice, or maybe even once. He says the word or the phrase productive forces. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, bro, where the fuck are the productive forces, you know? And he's like, oh, yeah. He's like, oh, it's the power, it's the power, it's the power, you know? And I'm like, what the he's like, where, you know, it's not as like this. I mean, you sound like he sounds at moments. I mean, if you just not paying attention, he does sound like a complete idealist at some points. If you're not like, okay, you know, you're being patient and you're waiting for all this kind of, you know, you have to, I don't know. It's just interesting, you know, like that he. It's something maybe to be followed up on later on. You know, like what is really the kind of um, yeah, his sense of materialism, I think, at this
Yeah, that
moment,
is
it's
interesting. Yeah,
is really interesting, and maybe also his abstention. Maybe it's the wrong word, but it's a fitting word for the moment now. But like maybe he's actively choosing to not do this because everyone is doing it, so he wants to do his own thing. I don't know.
Mm. Well, anyway, my sense of materialism is making me think that I need to give
Yeah,
my son back his bedroom. You know, so
yeah.
this is where we are. Look,
Yeah,
in Oscar's room.
yeah.
He's
Okay.
got to go going to England tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the morning. Well, I'm taking him there.
Okay.
See,
All right. Thanks for
bag is
tonight.
packed, you know.
Okay, all
So,
right, guys. Nice one.
but it was good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Peace
See
out.
you guys
and,
again.
Stick with it, boys. We're gonna get there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
don't worry about that. We'll be all right.